Hello, everybody. So, today I wanted to discuss a topic that is at the heart of Crowley's vision. I underestimated the Neoplatonist influence and the Orphic mysteries that resulted from Neoplatonist thought to begin with. This is most likely already known to seasoned occultists, but I hadn't explored this area at all, and now I've come to the realization that all of it, anything Hermetic related, makes total sense to me now. I've also come to a closer understanding of what Crowley attempted to establish, but he gave his own spin on it. I happened to have stumbled upon a book that gave me a lot of insight, and perhaps Crowley has read it himself. I also made a start at reading The Republic by Plato and came to the realization that Plato, as the enemy of poets, might be one of the many heads that formed the beast on the lust card. So before that, I'm going to preface this with all of the impressions that I had prior. My spirit team pointed me towards a specific book that I purchased maybe a year or a year and a half ago, but never delved into. I just got too busy with work, which would be the Orphic Mysteries, the Orphic Hymns by Patrick Dunn, I think his name is. Yeah, Patrick Dunn. So we have to retrace our steps and review the art card once more, taking into consideration the flanking cards that surround the heart of the tree, as well as the redemption of the daughter ascending from Mohud, returning to the state of the void, and the mad fool's emergence from said void. We have to take into consideration Crowley's changes to the strength card, in which he redirected the forces and fashioned them after a Dionysian philosophy. The lust card, as Crowley has renamed the strength card to suit this particular vision, also reveals some parts, I believe, of Crowley's discovery himself. The beast, a moniker that Crowley's mother bestowed onto him and he eventually claimed for himself, is the deep passion of mixing ideas and feelings that have generated Crowley's enlightenment. This is what I suspect, anyway. This lust card would not be able to exist below the art card for a myriad of reasons, and one of these reasons is in fact the underlying motive that emerges from Neoplatonist thought of Orphism. We can witness Crowley's road to relative freedom, the seven-headed beast, an ironic take on the faith that he left behind. Now, I personally haven't read the Book of Daniel at all, but I imagine a lot of the irony stems from this body of work. And I also see that Crowley has dressed the Hierophant in the garb of a Babylonian priest, the enemy of the Hebrew people. I personally believe that, and I wanted to make a video about it, but I'm not so sure if I should, because it's all speculation, but I believe that this was inspired by Nabonidus, a priest king, but also a reformer, which is in spirit of what Crowley is intending to do, or what the Hermetic line of thinking is intending to do. The Babylonian ruler in question sought to appoint the moon god, called Sin, as the supreme god, and this is a bit unusual, and it was also quite unpopular at the time because gods were generally appointed to cities, and the city that turned into the capital, that god was heightened as the supreme patron of its denizens. I haven't really looked into it too much, but I assume this is also how the Hebrew god became heightened and favored, probably merged with other gods and then became favored. Although if we read Ezekiel's work, it becomes rather clear that God saw the diasporic Jews and adopted them, favored them and adopted them. Anyway, so it was thanks to recovery of Nabonidus' writings, many writings in fact, during Crowley's time no less, that a lot of information about Babylon was recovered, cementing its existence as a real place and lending credence to its references within the Bible. A moon god named Sin was probably something Crowley thought was quite amusing. And as explained in another video, the Hierophant and the devil are tied together through gematria. However, Crowley's devil points to something else entirely, which would be the free father or liber pater, a god of free speech and free will, most notably a patron for the commoner, the plebeians. And eventually this god merged with Bacchus, the god of wine, dance and ecstasy. So the Free Father was considered an infectious cult, an underground movement that enjoyed heightened popularity during the Roman Republican times. But these are still kind of like speculations, right, floating about. But they paint a rather clear picture to me from what I understand that Crowley, the path that Crowley had to walk. So all of these various elements are there to support the end result, and that would be Crowley's Fool card, obviously. I can say with certainty that Crowley has a fondness for those who think differently, and he went as far to scrub his deck from the Christian footprint, curiously changing the traditional virtue cards of temperance, strength, and justice, but also judgment. And these are generally present within a traditional tarot game. Now, I cannot say with certainty that I fully understand his mascot, his Babylon, but other than that, her name suggests a confusing, a mad babbling, and perhaps highlights that Dionysian state of holy madness. But at first glance, she appears to be his version of Shekhinah, and she seems to be modeled after, well, what they say, the whore, but also seems to be completely clothed or fully clothed in the derogatory descriptions of Israel as found within Ezekiel's work. Now, Israel on sich, I should kind of unpack or defang, because the word and the place is heavily politicized right now in the current climate. So there is the Assembly of Israel as worded within the books and the Zohar, and then there's the Knesset, the secular governing body of the State of Israel. Although they may converge to the Orthodox Jew, they might not for the occultist. And it should be noted that Jerusalem, to Christians and Jews, formed the heart of the world for a very long time. And you can find these special leaf maps where at the heart of 3 petals lies Jerusalem, and each petal forms a different continent that lies adjacent to the city. And this is probably one of the reasons why the world card of tarot will point us to Ezekiel's story surrounding the Temple of Jerusalem originally, and why its path is considered rather severe, but also considering it is the world, or also olam in Hebrew, is reminiscent of the Hebrew word meaning hidden. So it will point us to the Assembly of Israel for sure, but also the hidden New Jerusalem, the heart of the world that is to come. And I should add to that as well that Israel is typically described as a rose within the Zohar, the 5-petaled Rosa Gallica that is white and red. Mercy and judgment are carefully considered, and these themes in metaphysical nature return to us in Rosicrucian lore. Israel's name is most likely comprised of the following words: Yashar, which meaning upright or straight, and El, meaning God. Alright, so with that out of the way, I wanted to focus on the Orphic cult or the Orphic mystery religion and Dionysos, or the figure of Harpocrates eventually turning into Horus, which is a similar story where the god Yakos turns or is reborn eventually into Dionysos. So we see Horus grows up. Harpocrates turns into Horus. Harpocrates is the child, Horus is the grown-up. And Yakos, surrounding this cult, is similar in the sense that he is an infant and dismembered by titans, and then he is reborn and reemerges as Dionysus. So there is a overlap here between the two themes. So the Orphic cult is a mystery religion, as I said before, and it is centered around soul worship. So if we look closer at the art card and we take into consideration Crowley's desire to breathe life to what was previously considered dead, we actually see a motif from Orphic belief shining through. So as seen here within this example, all things would contain a body and a soul, and duality rests on the material vessel holding an immortal essence called the soul. Here even storm clouds are mentioned as an example, which is an interesting coincidence, perhaps, because that is exactly how Ruach emerges itself, metaphorically speaking, that is, as the airy spirit of God rising from the Sa'ara, the storm wind. From the most basic perspective, it does make sense, right? We are reminded of our inner realm, hidden or relatively opaque to others, but very clearly a reality to ourselves. Not only does it manifest through the inability to recognize someone's internal thoughts and feelings, people will misunderstand what lies beyond the external appearance more often than not. So already judged before one has a chance to speak one's mind, or we can choose to remain hidden and act from a place of subterfuge instead. This is the very first understanding of this inherent duality that we have to learn to wield as a child growing into an adult. And so as someone passes this reality or the phenomenon of an internal reality that happens to reside within us all, although difficult to grasp and understand, is clearly and obviously separate from the lifeless husk that is left behind. And if I think back on my own experience, my very first encounter with the death of somebody I really held dear, this person, although I could see her body, was near unrecognizable to me. So it's a harsh reality to come to terms with, and that the person that is left behind, this husk, this body, the person that we loved, is no longer there. So in the greater scheme of things, and I'm abstractly speaking obviously, it defines the existential battle of mortality, generating a drive originating from fear, a drive originating from morbid curiosity, a reality that is both gripping and terrifying. Life is opposed to death, and death is opposed to life. But the Orphic cult marries these two states of existence and creates the philosophy of immortality, both in life and in death. This means that after life comes death, and after death comes life. We see it very clearly in the art card. And the other hint that we have, of course, is that it is not only flanked by both the devil and the death card, but on the cauldron we can see a skull with the crow perched on top of it. So within the Zohar, it is highlighted that the letter Samech, incidentally looking like a snake biting its own tail, also relates to achieving a state that is reminiscent of meditation. King David reveals he performs 60 breaths, and after said 60 breaths, he does not slip into a state of death, yet achieves the experience of Tiferet. Samech, having the value of 60, has a very close relationship with Tiferet. It is the sixth sphera, not only encapsulating the aspects of mankind as the essence is that of Vav, or Adam, but it is here where heaven and earth meet, and you can consider David's star as a means to understand this alignment more closely. And so within the Zohar it is explained that there are 60 breaths below and 60 breaths above. Why would they say it like that? This isn't the easiest or clearest way to explain what someone means, but I suspect it is because Tiferet also holds some secrets about the Garden of Eden, and this is essentially also the name for heaven, or the afterlife in Hebrew tongue. I think most, if not all, traditional Kabbalists will tell you that Tiferet is, therefore, inaccessible to us. The Hermetic tree appears to function a little bit differently, but I don't know these details just yet. However, a Kabbalist also believes in reincarnation. And this is tied to the reparation of the world and reinstating of God's light. So as long Malchut remains egoic, the Kabbalist will return to heal the world. So this aspect of a religion centered around the soul rather than material reality is what highlighted here. A soul will have many accidental states. In fact, I'm going to add this example that I found that is kind of interesting, although I have nothing intelligent to say about it, but you know, Ajax, named after the eagle that Zeus sent to Hercules, chooses to become a lion, and Agamemnon, whose name implies resolute thinking, who came from a cursed bloodline. Because of Tantalus, his ancestor, he decided upon becoming an eagle. And then there's the 20th lot, which is also kind of interesting, but all of this is just a side note. All right, so I mentioned Iacchus a little bit earlier, and Iacchus is a minor deity whom actually is separate from Dionysus, but he became more and more identified with the god of wine. And it's also interesting that Iacchus, just like Ajax, comes from the root to cry. And this term was also used to invoke a song or an hymn. It was not necessarily associated with Iacchus, but it's still interesting. Another thing that is interesting about this particular deity is that he has a very well-known motif to us, which is that of the mother. In this case, this is Iacchus as the son of Demeter, rather than Zeus and Persephone. The son of Demeter, he is on her lap, and he kind of really resembles that relationship between Isis and Horus, or the Virgin Mary and Jesus. And all of these have a story around rebirth as well. So Iacchus and Dionysus Zagreus, which is then the son of Zeus and Persephone, would become the center of the story surrounding this Orphic cult. And we see a bittersweet infusion perhaps of grief and of festivity. And the reason as to why Dionysus Zagreus became known as the agent for rebirth was because he himself was birthed 3 times within his myth. Another thing is that I found this sentence in this book that I found very curious. And it says, "To forget is the one gate of annulment." And this lends credence to the idea, of course, of ancestor and soul worship, where souls occupied or took residence in everything, even that which is dead, as gleaned from Crowley's art card. But the idea that a person who dies is simply, to put it bluntly, obliterated through forgetting is probably the most poignant part of it. And so memory and remembrance played a huge part in keeping a spirit alive. It is also a very fragile and painful reality of existence juxtaposed to non-existence. Memory was so incredibly valued within Greek culture. The Muse Mnemosyne was frequently invoked, and what I find so fascinating is that in one of the paintings of her, done by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, we see her holding a lamp that resembles remembrance. And I'm instantly reminded of the hermit, whom in Crowley's vision glances upon the Orphic egg. Depending on how we look at him, we see an old man, or we can see the manifestation of Thoth. And here we see a return also to the very idea of the cult of Asclepius. Mnemosyne played a large part in the activity of lucid dreaming, bringing offerings to her before going into a state that would be considered most holy to the cult, to incubate. They would sleep and pray for meaningful visions and insights. As you can see, the ties run so far, and they run very deep. And I have to keep it a bit streamlined, even though it's not exactly easy to keep a narrow path at this point. But my horizon is the Lustgard for now. So that's where we're traveling towards. So in another video, I have already touched on the incredible journey that is hidden within a single paragraph of the adjustment card, showing the unification with the creator, or perhaps more aptly, the creative void, the return to a creative void. And this process itself is described within the Sefer Yetzirah as returning to an embryonic stage, and if narrowly associated with the idea of sleep, perhaps it reveals the path that only a soul can take. And this is also why Hermes, initially the god of the wind, but also guide of souls, is playing such a big part in Hermetic philosophy. The secrecy is innate because it reveals something about our second hidden nature. Alright, so let's look at the strength card, the manifestation of a Dionysiac explosion of ecstasy. And we can see her, Babylon, make offerings herself as she brings forwards the cup, presumably filled with blood, which nourishes and vitalizes the soul as believed by ancient Greeks. She appears to represent the Maenad, a devotee of Dionysus. And this particular passage gave me flashbacks to what was written about the art and lost art in particular. It made me consider if this old book was read by Crowley himself at one point, but I cannot say for certain. Maybe it's a coincidence. This brought about the necessary inspiration to write about it in the first place anyway. So the seven-headed beast, as I explained earlier, is comprised of the influences that were pressed onto Crowley's psyche at one point, leading to the rejection of the conventional line of thinking of his culture and his time. They are collectively known as the beast only for their adversarial stance against the status quo. One thing we have to discuss here is that Crowley decided that he wanted to redirect the force, so to speak, for the state of being, Babylon in this case, his Shekhinah, I suspect, experiences an outpour from the heavenly, merciful Sphera of Chesed, and this Sphera is also known as loving kindness. The mind does not repress or reject, but takes all of it in, generating a revival akin to the Bacchanalia, the drunken haze infused with worship for Bacchus. It says here to break free from one life and live another. Now, within mind and soul rather than in the flesh, we see the blossoming, the revitalizing of the inner Horus, the Dionysian child. The hermit also represents the spermatozoa in Crowley's mind, capable of fertilizing an egg, first still an egg, but then an infant, and eventually fully emerges as the horned fool, which happens to be an earlier depiction of Dionysus. It is both the fool and judgment that have a dialogue with one another here, and this is probably the most mysterious or secretive part of this whole journey. This is true for both the technicalities of tarot and also the Orphic ideal of cleansing and liberation. Judgment brings forth the birth of Horus, which in Crowley's terms brings about a new era, the post-modern era. The fool and judgment have exchanged meanings at one point, and this happened through the agent Shin. The Hebrew letter, once attached to the fool, is now attached to the judgment card, and the fool was given the letter Aleph instead. Now, this is the interesting part. Also, all of it's interesting, but this is very interesting. Aleph and Lamed create the word for God. Aleph and Shin create the word for man, or Ish. And I suspect this is the tilting that is also mentioned with Nietzsche's work, actually, where God and man are starting to have a power struggle, perhaps. And man becomes higher than God, which is kind of interesting. I don't know, this is just an observation. So, as it is written within this book, and I actually like the way he describes it. It's called the uplifting power of new insight. Okay, so with that aside, this process, at the very least, I can say, and I like the way that it is described in this book, particular. It is called the uplifting power of new insight. That is the whole process. That is the whole point of it, and that is at the very least, the conversation that the fool has with the Eon card. Now, meaning, I think its meaning is inherently metaphysical and therefore not a moral type of salvation. So this truly aligns with Crowley's disdain for the rigid church body that attempted to educate his younger self. Now, as art implies a repeated process, this is also true for the Orphic cult, where the souls go through a long circuit of births. Now, the reason why I think Plato considered the enemy of poets, which I think is something Crowley could relate to, having been denigrated to being the beast by his own mother, of all people, is that this book exclaims very astutely that Plato's philosophy is building on a faith, and this faith is Dionysianism. And that means, to me at least, that in order to understand Crowley better, we'd have to exhaust Plato's library. And that is, I think, in broad strokes, the path that Crowley intends to explain, albeit very opaque in various areas. And I wonder what you think in this case, because there's so much more to uncover. And it's also that Crowley has had many influences taken from the Eastern philosophies, of which I still believe that with this all in mind, I feel this is the straightest path towards understanding Crowley and what he intends to do. Now, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm sorry it took a long time. Have a great day.